Okay, in this episode, we're going to find out if tubes and a real cab really make that big of a difference between going through the Helix direct or through an FR cab. So here I am in my living room. This is where I do all my practicing. And what I have here are two different setups. The first setup is the Helix directly into my Friedman ASC12 FR cab. And the impulse response that I'm using in my Helix when I run it through my FR cab is a live ready sound Mesa 212 with vintage 30 speakers in it. The other setup that I'm using is the Helix plugged directly into my Synergy SYN5050 all tube power amp, and that's plugged into one of my Mesa 212 cabs with vintage 30 speakers in it. The amp model that I'm using for both setups is the PV Panama, and it's set up exactly the same way for both. So I'm going to go ahead and play the same riffs through each setup, and then we're going to talk about what I'm experiencing there. Well, I hope the Rode mic that I have hooked up to my camera picked up all of the differences between the two setups, whether they're subtle or they're big. And I'm not just talking about the tonal differences, I'm talking about all of the things that I'm going to be discussing here in a minute, because I really want you guys to hear this for yourself and not just take my word for it. Well, that said, stay tuned, because later in this episode, I'm going to actually have both of these setups in a full mix for you to compare. I'll have a few isolated tracks as well. Okay, so what I was experiencing here when I had the Helix plugged directly into the FR cab was I was hearing a lot of like sizzle and crackling and a bunch of noise on top of all the notes I was playing. I noticed it more when I was doing palm mutes or any kind of chugging. I could hear all of this connective tissue, for lack of a better term, in between all of the notes and all of the palm mutes. There was all this like noise and staticky kind of sizzle going on, and I really couldn't do anything about it. It was just there. But when I played through the power amp and real cab, I didn't get hardly any of that. I was getting a lot more clarity, and all of that sizzle and crackle, it was almost like somebody took a lid and put it on the pan of frying bacon, and it kind of muted a lot of that. There was still a little bit of it there, because this is still a digital platform, and that is one of the tendencies that they have. But there was much less of it, and there was a lot more clarity, and I could hear the separation in between the notes. Especially when I was doing the faster kind of tremolo type picking, I didn't hear all of that noise in between the notes. I could hear the separation between every stroke of the pick over the strings, where again, when I played the Helix direct into the FR/FR cab, that wasn't the case. And in fact, there was so much noise and so much crackling fizziness going on there, it almost kind of sounded mushy. It didn't sound very percussive at all. It just sounded kind of mushy, and there was no like real pick attack there. There was just a lot of just, I don't know, I keep saying this, but a lot of noise in between the notes. Now the reason why I was doing some soloing is because I wanted to see if there was the same issue when I was playing that kind of stuff. And to be honest, it wasn't as noticeable there. There was still, when I was plugged in direct, there was still a little bit of a noise issue there, but again, it wasn't as noticeable as when I was doing like rhythm type stuff. Okay, so aside from all of the fizz and all the sizzly noise that I noticed when I was going direct with the Helix, I noticed also that the top end just wasn't as good. It wasn't as percussive. It was decent. The tone is decent. It's actually decent tone. It's passable. But the top end just didn't have that really nice crisp attack. It didn't have that nice snap to it, especially when you compare it to playing through a real tube power amp and real cab. When I played through the real cab and the real power amp, what I noticed was there was a really good, again, note separation, but aside from that, the top end was much better. It was much crisper. It had a nice snap to it. The guitar was way more percussive. There was a lot more clarity there. And the other thing that I've mentioned before in my live streams is that whenever people come over and they play through any of my processors, whether it's a Helix or a Kemper or anything, when they run it through a FR/FR cab, no matter what make or model, they always want me to turn the gain down. They always think there's too much gain, and it's because of that top end. It's that sizzly kind of fizziness that's going on. It makes them think that there's too much gain. No matter how much gain you have or not have, it's always going to be there no matter what. But I could take those same settings, literally, on any digital platform and run it through the real power amp and cab. All that stuff's gone, and they never say turn the gain down. It always sounds very clear. The top end is very clear. It's clean. There's great note separation, and all that fizz and crackling effervescent type stuff that's on the top is gone. It's just gone. So the top end is way better. I wish I had a better way of describing it, but that's the best I can do. You know. Now regarding the bottom end, when you run it through an FR/FR cab, the bottom end is definitely looser than it is when you run it through a real tube amp and cab. The bottom end in a real amp and cab scenario is just a lot tighter, and it just sounds and feels more natural. Okay, so now let's hear how both setups sound in a full mix. And after that, we'll follow up with a discussion about the pros and cons of each setup. All right, now let's hear a couple of isolated tracks so you could really hear the difference between the two setups. Okay, so did you hear all of that noise, that sizzle and that crackling kind of effervescence on top of all of the notes with the Helix plugged in direct? I'm going to give you one more chance to hear the difference between the two, and then once you hear it, you'll never be able to unhear it again, and it'll stand out like a sore thumb. Okay, so now let's go ahead and talk about the pros and cons with each setup. So here are the pros about going direct. Obviously, it's more convenient, right? You have less gear to lug around, maintain, set up, tear down. You don't have to worry about mics. It's lightweight. It's more consistent because, again, you're not miking it every night and worried about mic positions. So every night it's going to be the same sound for the most part. Takes up less travel space, so you don't have to worry about not being able to bring things because it won't fit in your trailer or whatever vehicle that you're taking to the gig. And it takes up less space on stage. We've all played those small stages, and it is nice to have a smaller footprint when you're performing live and having to share stage space with several other band members. And last but not least, lower cost, because again, you're not buying as much gear when you go direct. Okay, so now let's talk about the cons associated with going direct. Number one, the sound quality is definitely lacking there because, as we heard, you're going to get more noise in between and on top of your notes. And that's especially noticeable when you're doing a lot of heavy kind of riffs, a lot of chugging, palm muting, and tremolo picking on the lower strings. And some more cons are basically the fact that the top end is dull, unnatural, and has a noticeable sizzle to it. To fix dullness, treble has to be turned up, which also brings more noise and sizzle. So anytime you're going to bring more treble into this, it just brings all that sizzle and crackling hiss with it as well. And as we discussed before, the bottom end is definitely looser and less natural when going direct. Okay, so another really big con with going direct is the rabbit hole. What do I mean by that? Well, when you go direct, what do you use? You use impulse responses. There are many, many companies that make impulse responses, and there are many, many impulse responses of many, many cabs, many, many speakers, and mic configurations of all of those impulse responses as well. You can stack them. You can actually make your own now with some companies where you can blend several together and make your own. And you can also, on some of these platforms like the Helix, you can actually have two separate impulse responses. So now it's two rabbit holes, right? Because you got to pick one for one side and one for the other when you split them left and right. So you have to go through all that every time you want to change any kind of impulse response. You're right back down in that rabbit hole again. And it does get confusing. And what we call it also is option paralysis. There's so many options, you spend so much time sifting through them all that you're not playing guitar. All you're doing is turning knobs and checking things, and you just get lost in that deep, deep, dark, scary rabbit hole. And a lot of times people never get out. They're always checking out new stuff. Now, don't get me wrong, options are great, but human nature is we're always going to be chasing all these new options all the time, and we're never going to be satisfied with them. And you guys know what I'm talking about. When you get into option paralysis, it's less playing and more tweaking. And that's not a good place to be. So to sum it up, the main benefit of going direct is convenience. But it comes at a price, right? I mean, the price is basically this. You're not going to have as good a sound because of all of the things that I discussed previously. And you're going to be down that rabbit hole, and you're definitely going to deal with option paralysis. Okay, so now let's talk about the pros and cons with the tube power amp and real cab setup. The pros are better sound, right? I mean, you heard it in all of the examples. You're going to get a better, crisper, more clean and percussive top end, and it's going to sound very natural, and you're not going to get all that sizzle and crackle that you heard in the direct setup. You're going to have a tighter, more percussive bottom end as well. It's going to resonate better, and it's just going to sound more natural, and it's not going to feel so loose. And last but definitely not least, no rabbit hole, no option paralysis, more playing, less tweaking. And you can trust what you're hearing because most of it is real. The power section and the cab are real. You don't have to worry about guessing anymore. So basically pick an amp model in the Helix, dial it into your taste, and let the power amp and the real cab take it from there. Okay, so I'm just going to post some stats on the screen regarding cost and weight differences between the two setups. I even did a third setup with the head rush so that we can see the cost and weight differences if you wanted to use a more economical choice for an FRFR cab. So is it really worth it to have a real tube power amp and a real cab to take with you to all of your shows? I mean, only you can make that decision, right? Because there's so many variables. How big is the stage that you're playing on? How big is the vehicle that you're taking to the gig? Do you really want to put in all the extra effort carrying this stuff in and out and maintaining it and hooking it up and tearing it down and lugging it in and out of your house and up and down stairs? Because believe it or not, some venues actually have staircases and they're pretty narrow. And bringing this stuff up and down those staircases is not fun. How big is the show that you're doing? How big of a stage do you have to play on? Because if you're opening up for some bands, they don't give you much stage space, and you have to really save room so that you can all fit in small spaces. Whether or not you're playing in front of another band that's taking up most of the stage, or you have the whole stage to yourself, some stages are just small, and that's just the way it is. So taking up less room on small stages with your gear is definitely a priority in those scenarios. A lot of times you have what we call blow and go setups, where you got several bands playing and you're on stage playing and you can see it, you can feel it when you're up there and you're almost done with your last song. You look over and the band that's going on after you is like a bunch of lions in the weeds waiting for you to get off the stage. And as soon as that last song is done, you got to grab all your stuff and you got minutes, like 8 minutes to get all that stuff off the stage. And the more gear you have, the longer it takes. And I could definitely feel that because I've been in those situations too, where it's like I have to get off the stage quickly and get out of their way. And conversely, when I have to set up, I don't want a very frustrating, stressful setup. I want to be able to just put something on the floor and get going really quickly and not be sweating bullets while I'm setting up and hoping everything's going to work out, because that can be very frustrating and stressful as well. So, you know, there's probably a million other scenarios I can give you, but you get it. Fill in the blanks with whatever your real situation is as well, and weigh all that in. Depending on what you're doing and your financial situation and all the things that we discussed and the stuff that you've experienced yourself, you have to make that decision. What this video was for was just trying to give you some facts and some food for thought and some comparisons so that you can weigh all that in with your specific situation. I hope that you guys found this educational, and I hope I brought up some stuff that maybe some of you haven't thought of yet. And I'd like to hear what your thoughts are as well. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. And to all my subscribers, I appreciate you more than I can say. And if you're new to the channel and you haven't subscribed, please do and hit the bell so that you can be notified when I come out with new episodes. Well, I got a lot of great stuff coming up, and I'll see you guys on the next one.